Well, let's see, where do we begin today? Here's a question from Lindsay, and I think I ought to give you Lindsay's background because almost 40 years ago today, Lindsay became the reason I teach painting, even began to teach painting. Um, it looks like we're going to have an artistic fly on our cup all day. Now, that's an interesting, nice situation. But so let me take the time, first of all, Lindsay, to say thank you for that welcome question. Will you teach me what Gemmell taught you? Lindsay had said to me, I know she's a doctor in zoology, having to do with the vision because of her interest. But she told me when she got to a certain point, she said, now I've done what my parents wanted me to do. Now I'm going to do what I want to do, and that is to study painting. So that's a fun story, Lindsay, and I hope you don't mind that I share it. And my answer to Lindsay was, well, yeah, you get a space and several other in the building and several other people to go with you, and maybe I can afford to do it. And she did all that stuff, and so thank you, Lindsay. And in the meantime, she's been a diligent student, not of mine as much as of the ideas associated with the Boston School, and as good a student as you'll find. With a nice, what do we call it, background in just studying. So, yeah, I could. Anyway, Lindsay's showing some frustration here with me. I just plowed through Hildebrand's book, The Problem of Form in Painting and Sculpture, and grasped maybe 10% of it. I read it again and see how much I get on a second pass. And by the end, I had some sense of what he was saying. He managed to make some sense of the illustrations. He doesn't link the illustrations well to the text or explain what he wants us to see in them. So I surmised maybe I knew why he'd used them as an illustration. But I really wasn't sure much of the time. I wonder if it would make a good video to summarize what he's saying, using examples that you could walk us through explicitly. Well, Lindsay, this puts me in the position of having to tell you how I read, and this is the expose of a non Oxford student. I would have probably been chastised and thrown out for the way I handle information. But one thing I did, one thing I did, I was looking for the continuity of this form. And I didn't read people's stuff and try to become a scholar of their ideas. I read people's stuff searching for, what would you say, catalytic, information that seemed pertinent to the vision I had, which was all evolving, of course, at the same time. And so when I'm reading, I wasn't reading this. I read through this just like you did, Lindsay. But I read it with the idea of just, what's this? What's this we got here? It's a problem of form. Form, I love form, I had a sculpture, early phase of my career was in sculpting. And so, of course, presumably he was going to talk about form as a sculptor. Of course, this thing said painting and sculpture. And by the time I read it, I was already well into paintings. But I still presumed that he was going to be talking about form the way I understood it at the time. And so I read it, and the timing was such that a number of things that he talked about, which I'll talk about today, just clicked in a sort of a synchronicity with Boston School painting, and with what I'd learned so far in my own evolution of best practices, best handling of the visual impression. By the way, I have to say I never thought of myself as an impressionist. I never thought of myself as a Boston School impressionist. I still don't. I actually just simply understand that what we're painting is the visual impression. And so I'm very happy to lose the capital on that word, capital I on that word, impression, much as Gemmell suggested. So that's the first question. I'll show you a picture of the book. By the way, and I meant to say, and so I'm telling you, Lindsay, I'm not going to sit here and try to explain to you definitively what he's talking about as if I was doing a book review. I can't do that. And I wouldn't presume, one of the things that's you saw already that it's very, very difficult to understand everything he's saying. And I didn't go find it valuable to go digging deeper and deeper. I took the value I I could from that, and which I'll share. And then I used it and put it to work. And everything I've done in studying, like words, has been immediately applied. It's always about application. I'm looking for the functionality of ideas in terms of, producing the look of nature on a canvas. And so I apologize for that, but I will give you enough of a background in his work as the course of, through the course of these quotes that I'm going to share with you. And I also want to say to all of you who are looking for a lot of pictures today, this is lecture 101. Thank Lindesay for that. Okay. All right. So here's the book we're talking about. Thanks to somebody online for opening up this page, showing a picture of Hildebrand and the inside cover of The Problem of Form. And so now you have that. And so now, but I have two people asking about this, and this is Richard. Richard says, I'm rereading Hildebrand. I'm wondering if you may have interest in discussing this concept from the intro on page 11. I've paraphrased to shorten. Comments in the brackets are mine. Sculpture and painting. This is now Hildebrand talking in the preface or whatever it is. Sculpture and painting are imitative since they're based on a kind of study of nature, and this ties down the artist because the problems of form he is dealing with when imitating come directly from his perception of nature. If the problem of imitating nature is the only one solved, the work can never attain a self-sufficiency apart from nature. To gain self-sufficiency, the artist must raise the imitative part of his work to a higher plane. Now, you hear me talk about that from time to time, and I think Richard fully understands me. I think Richard was in a workshop, an intensive workshop, and I think he was... It was well, I guess you could say, I was going to say documented, how I think about this. Well expressed, I think, or if not well expressed, it was certainly expressed. So this is a continuation of this. As in a drama or symphony, our perception enables us to realize a unity of form lacking in the objects themselves as they appear in nature. The concept of the Architect Tonic. Through architectonic development, painting emerges from the sphere of mere naturalism, straight copy of nature, into the realm of true art. So I don't disagree with your paraphrasings there, that you're the straight copy of nature and the concept of the Architect Tonic, Richard. I think I should stop there just a second. What he means by the Architect Tonic is the structure of a painting in the spatial sense, in the three-dimensional world sense, on a two-dimensional surface, but fully encompassing the deeper thing. So it has an element of the architectural. And but it is that whole thing that we talk about endlessly, about you have a rectangle there, and then you have a set of relationships, and all these things are placed in a way that you could say forms the architecture of the rectangle. You'll have to work all these ideas through for yourself as you're painting to even begin to understand what I'm talking about. So explicating, that's, as I would have said to you so many times, I was wanting right there on the verge of asking Gamel to explicate, and Gamel was not willing to do that. He wanted you to think through what he had told you. And better yet, I like the Oswald Chambers model of work through what he's told you. In contrast to painters whose interest lies in depicting the general detail and some concepts, you've touched on pertaining to truth in art, making it like and making it more like. Do you think his architectonic idea relate to the Boston School Impressionist paradigm, the this to this, that to that, etc., which is, of course, and again, that's point, I guess you could say classic Impressionist with Monet involved paradigm, this to this, that to that. Yeah, and so make it as like as you can, then make it more like. That's actually a Bonnat thing, where you're talking about how to, just how to execute a good painting or a good likeness of something or other, anything. So that's always going to be the case. There's a certain amount of likeness in it, which this guy doesn't gainsay. But he, in fact, says that we're after something different. The making a better and better likeness is not preemptively the point, but the point is the architecture of the rectangle. made of the visual, and that's what we're going to get into next. So, Richard, thank you for that question. I think, Lindsay, you'll see that ties to your, in significant way, ties to some of what you're asking about. But this fly really wants my coffee today. I don't think I've had a visitor like this before. We're way out of season. One fall day, we had all these nice windows open, beautiful weather, and so it included having a whole mess of flies decide to descend and take root here. Set up housekeeping, I guess is the expression. All right. All right, so here we go. And I will show some pictures toward the end, but I just want to talk about some of the points that are talked about in the book with the idea of sort of beating around the bush toward what Hildebrand is really after, and more than that, what I really take from it all as useful for what we do pictorially. Remember, Hildebrand is as you see it, like a good third, if not more, of the book is dedicated to sculpture, and it's clear to me, at least, that even though he gets all this sort of stuff, he's got a slightly other vision. He says the same things we do, though, so it's possible, Lindsay, again, in this case, that I just don't fully grasp what he's also saying. But let's just follow through. You'll see you'll see enough hints that we can hang on, and let's presume that that's what he means overall. So here he says the pictorial representation. That's a pictorial representation. You know what I mean? The pictorial. That's the two-dimensional phenomena. Transforms all actual values to relative ones. So when you begin to turn something into a picture, we're not talking about actual values. We're talking to relative ones, which have a validity only for vision. In this way, the equation becomes the actual. In this way, the equation between the actual and the perceptual comes to exist. So there's the real world, here I am, and then there's what you see in terms of the darks, the lights, the different colors, the transition of values that produces a sense of form, and all those things. That's the visual or the perceptual, okay? And so that's the connection. The visual world, the actual world, is made of these visual things. The visual things are what we make pictures out of. The entire actual form resolves itself into visual relationships and value. The entire actual form, that's the real thing here, resolves itself into visual relationships and values. And the idea of the object is transformed into ideas of values for vision, which have their meaning only in and through the given total impression. Here we are. Just, can you see that? Now, what you want to do to follow when I say, whenever you hear that word visual impression, just go 2D with your eyes. Just see just me in this little world as if it were a painting, as if it were flat. And you'll begin to have a little grasp of that. All right. Okay, so it's essentially characteristic of the perceptual form that each single factor in the perception should have its meaning only in relation to all other factors, that all sizes, all lights and shades, all colors, oops, we lost a word there, etc., have only, a letter, I mean, all colors, etc., have only relative values. Everything influences the value of everything else. When we speak, therefore, of a total impression, we refer to the effect produced by the cooperation of all the factors in the perceptual form. That is what you see with your eyes, what you perceive with your eyes. The single parts of which it is made up can have no meaning in themselves alone, but gain their significance only through that peculiar connection which constitutes their total unity. Now, this is all about the big impression. This is all about the interrelationships of visual phenomena that makes up a picture. That's all we're talking about. And what we're also saying, though, that there's no actual values, right? So the sight size guy is trying to make an actual color value over here that matches is going to have this big problem because you won't be able to let all the other factors have interplay, because some of them you can't achieve. Some of the darkest darks you can't achieve. Some of the lightest lights you can't achieve. And I'm talking about as if they were factual, as if they were actual. And a lot of the colors, intensities and those sorts of things. So he's simply supporting all those things you've heard every impressionist say, that the world's everything must be reduced to the relative, which is something you can do successfully once you accept it as a perceptual world, as just a visual phenomena, and not as real things. By the way, I hope this is a clearer picture for you. We have a new computer working here now. Thanks to you, it was enough over time to get us this new used computer. So here we are, more discussion. Vision in its very nature is two-dimensional. Now, any number of these things that we're talking about, I'd already read about in the Boston School thinking, in other places, directly related to painting. So when I run into this guy, it's all supportive. It's all coalescing and giving me some better sense of what the nature of this thing is and more confidence. So have that in mind, that what's happening is I'm getting reinforced in terms of the concepts I'm already understanding a little, and I'm having my brain expanded a little bit. But vision in its very nature is two dimensions, okay? Vision. So the retina, it's two dimensions. We've talked about it before. The ocular is not the real. It's not a thing that can be touched. It's only in the visual projection, the 2D image on the retina, that these demands cease and permit the unitary plane of the picture to produce its full effect unspoiled. This constitutes the great value of the visual projection. Now, this is important right here because the word projection there means like a camera projector on a screen, visual projection. So all this stuff comes into your eyes and is sitting on the screen of your retina. That's what he means by it. You know that he also introduces, I also introduce you to the idea of the projectivity of some parts over others, but that's like projecting this as in protruding. That comes later. But don't confuse those two. And, one of these days I should come up with better words so they separate the multiple meanings of projectiveness or projection. So this constitutes a great value of the visual projection. It affords the only possible perception of form at a glance. Okay? For it's the only perception made up of homogeneous, that is purely visual elements. Okay? So our world is now all the same, homogeneous elements. Darker, lighter, more red, more yellow, more blue, but just color values. And then what happens where they meet and where they locate and that sort of thing. So if you understand that sort of thing, we're talking about that's the nature of the visual experience, right? The purely visual experience. Not the part of the experience that has us going in and trying to sort out for ourselves whether the thing is safe to walk toward, whether it's sharp or whether it's whatever. When you first have vision as a child, you don't even have any sense of distance. None of that's there. You have to reach out. When you touch something, all of a sudden it clicks. There's something in your brain that starts understanding distance. We're not interested in understanding. We're actually interested in just exploring the two-dimensional plane of the retina. So there's my discussion about the projection. Okay, the two kinds of projection. One is image on a screen, and then the second one is something that sticks forward. But you got my meaning on that. All right. So this is continuing these conversations. The conception of relief springs from the impression of a visual projection. Why he doesn't just say a visual impression on your retina or something. But anyway, the conception of relief springs from, in all those stages, from low relief to high or better, from shallow to deep, the thing of importance is that their effect on a plane be forcibly expressed. In other words, you got to get your value relationships right, for example. In other words, a sufficient number of the highest points of relief should be in one plane for this plane to... Okay, now this is actually not what he's talking. Let me get back to this. In other words, a sufficient number of the highest points of the relief should be in one plane, and this is where I went electrifying. I was actually electrified. I began to realize something that nobody had explained in the Boston School. Well, except the idea of coming out of a fog. In other words, a sufficient number of highest points of the relief should be in one plane. So it's as if to say, I'm the relief here, and certain parts stick out more than others. My nose, if I'm sitting like this, my fingers. So this whole sense of several things all being on the first plane. All of a sudden, that was a really electrifying thing to me, and I thought that. They just went through my brain like like lightning. And in other words, a sufficient number of the highest points of relief should be in one plane for this plane to impress us as such. But let an isolated point, and this is where it really broke through, but let an isolated point protrude noticeably, and it will appear to be before the frontal plane of the volume of space being expressed. Well, that didn't mean a whole lot to me, but the idea came through better with the idea of an isolated point sticking forward. So, but all these things were contributing to my idea of visual order. That is, there's some, instead of being instead of being things sticking forward, from a relief sculpture, some parts being more forward and some being a little further back, and then the whole far back part, sort of the three planes idea. This came across to me. This electrified in me the idea of visual planes. That is to say, the projectiveness toward your eye. And I found, I blurred my eyes down, and then all these top visual things, they formed that first plane. That's the breakthrough thing, Lindesay, and that was what I really pulled from this book initially. That was the first thing, and it was electrifying. As I said, the word electrifying, I can't say it too many times. Differences of depth. Now, this is just talking about that group of things that then do project toward your eyes. Differences of depth may combine, producing the effect of a single plane. So you don't have to have, when you're laying a picture in and you're creating these high contrast spots that project to your eyes, they don't have to all be the same, but they all have to be considered as he's saying that, he's finding that useful to be considered that first plane. And through this through contrast may cause others to show their difference more forcibly. So the setting up of this first plane helps the secondary and third ones. So he's concerned a great deal when he talks about form. He's concerned about the third dimension, the sense of form in toward this way rather than just this way. When people talk about form, I've mentioned before, you find these rather confusing. Do you mean shape? Do you mean modeling? Well, you mean something about both of those things. But when you're talking to Hildebrand, he's talking about internal space, and you'll run into that again with Benson. Actual and visual form are not the same, and the concept of relief is attached to the visual, not to the actual form, for it's with visual effects that we're concerned. Now, why is that important, right? But just to this degree, and that is that Gamel's conversation with us included that idea that we paint the visual, not the actual. In other words, everything we're doing is the visual, not the actual. And the idea of relief in painting, the idea of projectiveness, is a visual thing. It's high contrast stuff that forms that first plane. That has nothing to do with whether it's really there. It could be in the background. It could be a highlight on a pot in the background, but it's all sitting up there forming that first plane. And those are the effects we're concerned with, just to put that into clear perspective or what shall we say, unambiguous clarity. This is a conversation, by the way, that is perfectly good to carry on further. A picture is a combination of lines and colors that set each other off. Now, this is Degas talking, right? And this is where we're getting to that idea of what Hildebrand is talking about. If a picture is a combination of lines and colors that set each other off, why isn't it a storytelling thing that has people doing stuff in relation to each other? Why doesn't he say it that way? Why doesn't he say you're depicting a phenomenon? A narrative. Why doesn't he say that? You're illustrating a narrative. Why doesn't he say that? But he doesn't say that. He says a picture. And there again is that pictorial. Remember the pictorial? It's a combination of lines and colors that set each other off. So here it is, this interplay of lines and colors, and that begins to be the stuff that I think of as the form of the form we're playing in. Now, don't confuse that with form as space, which Hildebrand is all about, okay? But to be satisfied, he wished that his work be complete, not by the perfection of the detail, but through its final harmonious effect. He looked for unity, first of all, in construction and the coordination of the various elements comprising the painting, the proper synthesis between drawing values and colors. Now, that's where you're getting really close to what Hildebrand is talking about. There's this whole idea of this interplay of visual stuff. And some of it's made from drawing, that's the spatial, and some from values and some from color. We've talked about all that, right, in other ones. We have a video, I think it was done in April. I think it might have been April of this year, about this. So if you want to look for that, it has to do with the visual versus the spatial. And I want to make it clear that in that video, I'm talking about the spatial meaning space this way, and the visual order, which is the projectivity toward the eye. So there's the real space and the idea of space in the picture, but there's the idea of visual projectiveness. Look at that, and to follow up, this is not, that's a separate line, but you might find this confusing. if you've already seen that one. So look at that and then look at this again maybe. So here we are again. Now this is Hildebrand talking about relationships, okay? A living proof of the existence of spatial nature lies in the splendor and magnificence of her color effects. They are indeed most forcible. I got this ahead of where I wanted to be, but I'm going to take it anyway, finish this up since I've started. Because at one point he's talking about the relationship of a finger to a hand and the whole thing to an arm and the whole thing to the picture in a very, very effectual way in terms of the idea of the relational, which I wish I'd included a little earlier. But he says, a living proof of the existence of spatial nature lies in the splendor and magnificence of her color effects. And there we are again. That's the word that Degas uses, right? They are indeed most forcible stimuli for spatial ideas. Isn't that interesting? The hues of a picture have a real meaning when they exist. Now, meaning does not mean mood now. When they exist in accordance with all the other space-evolving factors. So we talk about high contrast, with sharp-edged spots coming towards your eye. Well, that's one of those types of things. The idea of no contrast, things receding from your eyes, or low contrast. And so color has a role to play, all related to the idea of projection, this way, of spatial idea in the third dimension. Of course, it can be said to be, if you have a red here, and then you see the distribution of reds through a picture, it's also spatial in the two-dimensional sense. And it also can travel as reds into a picture and not just sit forward from all the other chromas. The hues of a picture have a real meaning when they exist in accordance with all the other spatial evolving factors, space evolvement, and are thus turned to account as a means toward the general end. There you are. True splendor of color can only be the result of a general artistic formation of the picture. Right? Follow that? True splendor of color. And then he talks about the relational world being what causes that. Yeah. All right. Now this is a comment from Hale, and I'm pretty sure this is from Hale, and I think it's in the Vermeer book. I put it down as from Hale. As soon as a painter no longer conceives of color as local quality, active in itself by contrast with other colors, but as a local effect of all the light in a space shared by all the items it contains, as soon as he attempts to perceive this subtler repercussion and use it, to give his work a certain unity, or it will give his work a certain unity different from that of composition, his conception of form is entirely changed. Do you follow that? Followed to the limit, he arrives at Impressionism. So this is, again, that whole discussion about how when you include color in the whole grand thing, you stop thinking of form just in terms of the roundness on a hand, or even the distance from a hand to a shirt. You actually now have this other grander sense of space, and if you want to call it that, form. In this case here, it sounds like he's using form exactly the way Hildebrand would be. He might be writing this about the same time as Hildebrand wrote that book. And this is Hildebrand again. For the percipient, the process of seeing, in the sense of reading off spatially the appearance before him, goes on quite unconsciously, interpreting the visual impression into a spatial idea. Okay? In other words, the spatial idea of the three-dimensional world is a product. Your brain does that. So if he's saying that if you give me the visual impression, if I give you the visual impression, I'll be giving you, your eyes will be able to take in the three-dimensional world, which we find classically. That's the thing I keep trying to sell this to you all with. Can we understand that if we paint the relationships of visual phenomena as it is, we're going to get a greater sense of three-dimensional space than by any other means? Certainly none that you will think out and try to make happen forcibly, like with transparent mediums and stuff. This unity which the artist makes of the visual impression and kinesthetic ideas. Now, kinesthetic ideas means the ideas of touch and what in that way, what you can find by moving your eyes this way and that, separations of distance and stuff. The unity which the artist makes of the visual impression and kinesthetic ideas together. So you're going to immediately have the ability with just the visual impression to see things as if they were touchable, as if they were understandable with touch, is the most fundamental source of our aesthetic enjoyment in a work of art. That's a point that you really want to think through. That idea of us being able to, with marks of color marks on a canvas, distributed on a canvas, produce this crazy sense of the 3D world being alive, being all there in a way that's tangible, virtually tangible, of course. So we may now. So this is the another discussion about the relative. Okay, so let's go through this one. This will take the most patience on your part. We may conceive the values of the actual form numerically, for just as in algebra we abstract from the numerical values and express only possible relations of A to B, so the pictorial representation transforms all actual values to relative ones. That's huge to know. Now keep remembering here that this is where I was. I was at this place where I'd already heard this to this and that to that, but this reinforces it in a huge way. It gets me thinking about it in a way that actually helps me to make it a useful part of my mental constructs, which are all very closely tied to your ability to paint. You know, don't fail to understand that. Okay. In this way, the equation between the actual and perceptual forms, and he's talking about getting them to come together, comes to exist. When I fixate visually a finger, I obtain a relative impression of the shape and size of its parts. When I fixate the entire hand, I see this finger in relation to the whole and obtain a new impression, which expresses the relationship of fingers to hand. Be patient here. When I attend to hand and arm, the impression changes again, and so on ad infinitum. The hand may have looked large when I attended to it alone. In relation to the arm, it may appear delicate because of the greater strength of the arm. At first, the form of the finger was considered as a total impression. Later, it became a relative impression with other cooperating forms. Yet the actual form of the finger remained constant. It was the perceptual form which changed. Okay? So your perceptions about it changed. Your visual perceptions. So your sense of things. So that's why we take in everything as a whole, because this finger has, I often say it has no meaning as a finger. It only has meaning as a function of a whole. And it's, in other words, its size and its angle and all these things are a product of the whole package. They're also, by the way, there to perform roles, as we'll talk about in a little bit. And Benson brings that up. So the entire actual form resolves itself, into visual relationships and values. And the idea of the object is transformed into ideas of values for vision, which have their meaning only in and through the given total impression. Now, I'm hoping that you, Lindesay, can see what I was drawing from this guy. It was things like this that were reinforcing what I already perceived, as opposed to trying to understand every aspect of what he's trying to do with this work. Admittedly, I'm not, as I said, I'm not that scholar. I had no idea of spending. In fact, I find that frequently with these books about painting. I'm not going to become a scholar in any one of these books. I wouldn't have time. I'm a painter. I'm trying to actually put these things into practice. I'm trying to find supporting data or useful data, that'll make me function better as a painter. So I'm into things. I'm mining, as I've said. I mine the gold. When I get the gold, I'm out of there, right? I'm not interested in well, apart from maybe coming from the out west, maybe putting the tailings back in the mine shaft. Anyway, but let's go to Benson now. Look at the picture as a whole all the time you're painting it, okay? So there we are, the total impression. Look at the picture as a whole, the whole time you're painting it. Everything is a function of everything else. This is the architecture of painting, is that functionality of everything into everything else. And it's employed in everything you can possibly be aware of visually in a painting. So you could say, let's just start with something, say easy, the values. There's this big dark mass in the middle. And there's a relationship between that dark mass, and I better bring up my laser beam here, which seems to work pretty good in this thing. But from this dark mass, you could talk about other dark ones spotted around and lesser dark ones. and then lesser and lesser and lesser values until you have other masses of wholly different values, you can begin to see we're just talking about values. Now, I could say about the distribution of those, and I could talk about the spotting, the placement of spots. That's one of those concepts. It's part of the architecture of this picture. And so we talk about the distribution. I often see this as either something like an S-curve or something like a spiraling thing that comes out of here and maybe spirals round and implies going round and round. So if you understand that we're talking about many levels of the architecture of this picture, color is one, the red, yellow, blue idea, the distribution of those things in a way that is, again, harmonious, pleasing, aesthetic is the right word. So, so then there's this idea of pattern, which comes up in a different picture, but this whole thing here establishes what we think of as pattern, these big flat masses that create, there's a grand phenomena of a big flat mass sort of over here, all broken up, like what would it be, like a certain type of wallpaper just blotched in a certain way, and to give a nice sensation. So Benson continues now. And this is where I'm taking off a little bit into the territory that you suggest, and that is to compare what I've been talking about and what I believe Hildebrand is primarily about with the Boston School. It's not definitive. I can't explain it necessarily better than this, but I want to just be able to address it all together. So Benson says you'll always get into trouble unless you design all the time you're painting. In other words, you have to be seeing what the visual stuff is in its interconnected ways, in its architectonic, universe, which is both three-dimensional and two-dimensional, patterning, stuff going in, stuff receding, just values and spotting. There's so much difference in these different types of things. Some of it's much more two-dimensional. All of it has a latent potential of going in, like low contrast versus high contrast. There's an in-out thing about that. And there are things that cause that a sensation, such as things that relate to perspective. You are so fascinated with painting, with making things, and this one everybody needs to listen to. He's talking to his daughter. Benson says, you're so fascinated with painting, with making things to look like reality, that you forget to design. And he talks himself about how it took him, he woke up something like, 10 years after he started painting to the idea that there's such a thing. And it changed everything for him. He just dropped everything he was doing. He sort of said, dropped this picture he was trying to make and threw it across the room, sort of thing. The things themselves should be made only at the very end. Till then, concentrate only on the values and relations of color and space. Now, here he is reinforcing the idea of space. The values, that's the idea of spotting, distribution of spots. Relations of color, you understand that pretty clearly. It's an architecture to that in the painting. And the whole entire space itself, the spatial, both in a two-dimensional and a three-dimensional way. Can you, with every mark you make, well, the way we do it, with the idea of articulating effects, especially the leading effects, we interplay all those things and watch for their interrelationships all the time in a pictorial way, aware of how they play on the screen. So there's Benson, and we can take that, just giving you a little bit of a pictorial world. I think I've seen this once, but I've forgotten about it. But this one gives you some idea of a couple different things. One is the idea of pattern. You see this light thing sweeping through, the big light thing, like a big S-curve, or like the head of a duck almost, or a heron or something, even with an eye, which it's not the kind of stuff you really want to be doing, but it's there as what we call pattern, right? He also has this block here, and you can see it immediately. It's picked up again here. You could argue here, and then again, there's a little version of it here, a variation, a shorter version of it here. But you can see these things as part of a continuum, their own subset. You can also see them drifting into the picture, going further and further away. So they form part of the third-dimensional architecture of a picture in their individual relationships, which you become aware of. But that's our world. And so if there's an orange color in here, you expect it probably shows up in other places. And of course, on the screen, it's not going to be the easiest thing to see. But even things like the texture, the marks of the brush, you expect if you have some here, you're going to see them again in other places. And I'm looking hard, shall we say, to do that. But that sort of thing is not, it's what you would expect. There's underlying architecture to this whole thing. And that is what we think of. All that stuff is what we think of as the form, rather than anything else. That's the pictorial content, and it forms up. That's the best way that I think of it. Okay, that's the best way for me to express how I think of it. So here he says, now, by the way, we're doing what he says. You should look at a landscape. Here's a way to get yourself into the right frame of mind, as if you were going to decorate a plate, to make a pattern that would successfully decorate the plate. And that's, of course, referring to the Greek vases, for example. And use the landscape before you to do it. Now, again, let's just look at that for a second. Well, let's not look at that one. This is the one I really want you to look at, is this one, because we looked at it before. But so you're just trying to see, you're trying to make an abstraction. Now, you can say, well, decorative, but it's two-dimensional beauty and more. But just in that part where you're talking about the distribution of things, making patterns, just in that limited way, there he is. So the idea of a pattern on a plate. People who write about painting rarely know what a painter's trying to do. It doesn't matter whether you use landscapes or birds or people. Try to fill your space with the best possible pattern. Only intuition will tell you what's right. Men have tried to do it by mathematics. And I agree with him. That's one of those things. Run from it. Run from the golden mean and all that sort of stuff. There's no requirement. The golden mean is just one possible framework for the proportions in a painting. But you don't have to have the golden mean. You just have to have a framework. You have to have a set of relationships that finds correspondence in the picture, in the total rectangle. So the Greeks had a feeling for it like no other people since, and that's something underrated. I'm glad he understood. I mean, I'm glad he's talking about that. It's something people don't understand, the idea that the Greeks had a feeling for proportion and knew how to replay it or to make, no matter what proportion, sub-proportion they made, to have it relate to the big proportions in that way, in that sort of way, right? That correspondence idea. So there's that picture. And you can, again, see parts that relate to other parts. Now, I've mentioned before that once you have an angle in a picture, say an angle like this, your eye immediately will pick up the set of other angles and interplay of angles that may relate to it. Some of them will be grander, or some of them will be less so. But the idea even of, say, of points and pointinesses, you know, is there a system of these pointinesses that you would want to become aware of? But the fact is, he's saying, be aware of those things. Be aware of those things more than anything else. Don't worry about the realism. That'll take care of itself. I hope I'm getting to something useful to you, Lindesay and Richard. So I'm going to give you this last bit here, and I like that it ends with the idea of a symphony, which is where we started. Benson told me of a conversation. This is now his daughter talking again, Benson's daughter. He told me of a conversation with his friend Charles Martin Loeffler, the composer. We were sitting in front of the fire and talking of pictures. Now, she's now quoting Benson, which he enjoyed and appreciated very much. Loeffler asked me to describe to him what went on in my mind when I was in the process of composing a picture. I tried to tell him as best I could and went on thinking and went on talking, I suppose, for half an hour. At the end of that time, I said, I don't know why I'm going on like this. It can't mean anything to you, or it can't mean much to you. He leaned forward and put his hand on my knee and said, my dear Frank, I'm greatly moved by what you've told me. By changing a few, how did I get a 3 in there? By changing a few nouns, that might be a description of exactly what goes on in my mind when I'm composing a symphony or an opera. Now that's what I hope you take from the idea of form. Now the problem of form, the way that Hildebrand's talking about it, is the problem. He says that the whole thing is about space. That's the form we're talking about. That's form. That's the form, and so it's complex. And in the case of painting, it goes to color and all sorts of other things. And he talks about color in sculpture as well, by the way. But have it in mind that when you can't get here, this is where you find me probably coming up with the idea of music. What we're trying to do is find the music. When you get to what we're talking about now, you're in that place. And the realism, the representation, you can have levels of what would you call that sort of thing of conscience about how realistic a thing might be, or other forces working in you about your, something you're afraid to not look like you can draw or something like that, that's all fine. But it isn't what's going to make the music ultimately in the picture. Now, if you look like you're really incompetent, it's going to destroy the music in the picture. I mean, you get a fun abstraction, but you'll lose something. And that's where I think I agree with him and with everybody, with the idea that the imitative is an interlocking part. That's the imitation interlocks with this stuff here. But the form, as I speak of it, is like music in the interplay of visual phenomena, like notes in a symphony. It's like notes and the interrelationship of notes and volume and all those other kinds of things, then an extension of notes and, all the complexities that are possible. That's a world that's only there for us. As Hildebrand says sort of at the beginning of this, if you take in exclusively that homogeneous field of the visual impression, that is, that makes up the visual impression, excluding the realism, it's not a factor in all this sort of stuff. Okay, and then that's also a factor in its own way. So yeah, Lindesay and Richard, I'm going to go back, as I usually do, to your comments at the very beginning. I'll just try to blow my way up there if I can. Will this thing work for me? There we go. I'm having to get used to the fact that this is set differently, to pull down instead of push up. Let's just look at your comments one last time and make sure there isn't something I've forgotten. I like to do that. I'm not sure if it's tedious for some of you watching. And I apologize for the lecture modality. I knew this was going to go long. Man, I didn't know it would go to 47 minutes. You know what? Because it's that long, I think I'm going to let this go. I'm just going to let you have your life back. So, Lindesay and Richard, thank you very much. And thank you all for your donations, your subscriptions. Look how we're moving in subscriptions. It's very nice to see, very promising. And for your sharing and your comments, and these two going together in the way I think of it, as an opportunity to talk about Hildebrand's problem of form that I allude to all the time and hint at all the time. And I'll just end with this one thought that I rather started with, and that is that when you're reading these books, what you're looking for is data that makes sense to you as you try to understand painting. And you're looking for somebody to give you a comment, a nod, a word, that to which your mind responds, yes, that makes sense. I wonder how that works. Because I've just found that pursuing your own line, first of all, instead of going into somebody else's book and then painting out of their book, virtually nobody does it anyway. But doing it that way is tedious, and you get to the end of the day and you're not yourself, and so you don't become this, we hold these things to be self-evident kind of guy, and therefore you don't contribute. There's a significant thing that you don't contribute. So I don't apologize for the way I handle information. And I'm always eager. It was very pleasant for me to go read through this entire book again, Lindesay, so don't think I didn't. But I can't make myself an expositor of Hildebrand any more than I can of Max Meldrum, any of those things. I can just talk about what I know and compare notes from time to time. So, all right, with that now extended into 50 minutes almost, thank you again. Please do share this with your friends as much as you can, and the rest. And we'll see you again. Maybe about 4 weeks, 5 weeks, maybe. We're going to do, 4 weeks, I think. We're going to try to do another one of those live ones. So I'm talking about it now so you have it in front of you. I'm also going to try to make sure I reach out to all those people that I missed getting noticed to the last time. All right. Okay. Good. Have a great painting week, guys. Ladies.